You need to understand something about power in the 15th century. It wasn't about who had the biggest army or the most gold. It was about who could make other men hesitate, who could plant a seed of doubt so deep in an enemy's mind that they would second-guess their own strength. The Ottoman Empire never hesitated. They had swallowed Constantinople. They had turned the Balkans into a graveyard of broken kingdoms. They moved like a force of nature, methodical and unstoppable. But in 1475, in a frozen valley in a place most of Europe couldn't find on a map, that empire learned what fear felt like. This is not a story about heroes. This is a story about a man who understood that survival requires you to become something your enemies cannot predict. His name was Stephen. History calls him Stephen the Great. The Ottomans called him something else. They called him the nightmare that wouldn't die. Before we go further, if you're interested in the darker, unfiltered corners of history, the stories that don't make it into textbooks, consider subscribing to Memento's Historians. We're building a community of people who want to understand the past as it actually was, not as we wish it had been. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's remarkable that we're connecting across continents over events that happened 5 centuries ago. Let's go back. 1451. Stephen is 17 years old. He is not a prince yet. He is the son of a prince, which in the medieval Balkans means he is a target. His father, Bogdan II, rules Moldavia, a principality squeezed between 3 predators, Hungary to the west, Poland to the north, and the Ottoman Empire to the south. It is a terrible place to hold power. You survive by bending to whoever is strongest at the moment. You survive by making yourself useful. You survive by never, ever making a stand. Bogdan made a stand. He tried to resist Hungarian influence. He tried to assert independence. And on an autumn night in October of that year, at a wedding feast in a village called Ryusini, his uncle Petru Aron walked through the door with armed men. There was no negotiation. There was no trial. Bogdan was dragged to the floor and beheaded in front of the guests. The wine was still warm. The musicians were still holding their instruments. And Stephen, somewhere in that hall, watched his father's head roll across the stone. He ran. He didn't have a choice. Petru Aron's men were hunting anyone with a claim to the throne. Stephen fled south into Transylvania, then into Wallachia. He became a ghost. A boy with no kingdom, no army, no future. He had one advantage. He understood that the world had shown him its true face. There was no honor. There was no divine right. There was only survival, and survival required you to be colder than the men trying to kill you. In Wallachia, Stephen found another orphan. His name was Vlad. History would later call him Vlad the Impaler. Vlad Dracula. But in those years, he was just another dispossessed prince, another survivor of the meat grinder that was Balkan politics. Vlad's father had been buried alive by rival nobles. Vlad himself had spent years as a hostage in the Ottoman court, where he learned that terror was a currency. If you could make men afraid enough, they wouldn't fight you, they would simply leave. Stephen and Vlad were not friends in the way we understand friendship. They were allies bound by mutual trauma. They studied each other. Vlad was fire. He was rage weaponized. He wanted his enemies to suffer, to scream, to know that crossing him meant a slow death on a wooden stake. Stephen was different. Stephen was ice. He watched. He calculated. He understood that fear was useful, but structure was permanent. You couldn't build a kingdom on terror alone. You needed institutions. You needed loyalty that went deeper than fear. You needed men who would fight for you because you had given them something they couldn't get anywhere else, a stake in the future. By 1457, Vlad had reclaimed the throne of Wallachia. He didn't waste time. He invited the nobles who had betrayed his father to a banquet, asked them politely how many princes they had outlived, and then impaled every single one of them. It was efficient, it was brutal, and it sent a message that rippled across every royal court in the region. Vlad Dracula did not forgive. Now it was Stephen's turn. Vlad gave him 6,000 Wallachian soldiers and pointed him north. Go home. Take back what was stolen. Stephen marched into Moldavia. He met his uncle Petru Aron on the battlefield at Dolgesti. This was not a complicated fight. This was revenge. Stephen's forces shattered Aron's army. Aron fled into Poland, and Stephen, at 24 years old, was crowned Prince of Moldavia in a field under an open sky. There was no cathedral. There was no pope. There were only soldiers and mud, and the understanding that power was something you took and held with your hands. But as Stephen looked at the men who had come to swear their loyalty, he saw something that chilled him more than any battlefield. He saw the same nobles who had bowed to his father, the same nobles who had bowed to Petru Aaron, the same nobles who were now bowing to him. Their loyalty was a transaction. It lasted as long as it was convenient. The moment Stephen showed weakness, the moment he made a mistake, they would open the door for the next man with a sword. He understood the problem. In Moldavia, as in most of Europe, the prince did not actually rule. The boyars ruled. The great noble families. They owned the land. They controlled the armies. The prince was a figurehead, a temporary manager who could be replaced if he asked for too much or gave too little. Stephen's father had been murdered because he forgot that. Vlad had solved the problem by killing everyone. But Vlad's solution was unstable. You can't kill your way to a functional government. Eventually, you run out of competent people, and you're left ruling a wasteland. Stephen chose a different path. He didn't just want to punish traitors. He wanted to make treason obsolete. He began a purge, but it was surgical. Every boyar who hesitated, every noble who sent a letter to a foreign court, every family that whispered about replacing him their estates, were seized. Their wealth was redistributed. But Stephen didn't give it to other boyars. He gave it to a new class of men. He called them the vitezhi, the brave ones. These were not aristocrats. These were lesser nobles, free peasants, soldiers who had proven themselves in combat. Stephen offered them land, titles, and a direct oath of loyalty to him. For the first time in Moldavian history, a peasant could become a landowner without being born into the right family. All he had to do was fight. All he had to do was bleed for the prince. And if the prince gave you land, you didn't owe your loyalty to some distant boyar who could sell you out. You owed it to the man who made you. This was revolution by slow precision. Stephen was rewiring the entire feudal system. Within a decade, he had built a standing army of 40,000 men who answered only to him. When he called, they came. Not because their lord ordered it, because Stephen had given them something no one else could, a future. But land and loyalty were not enough. Stephen knew that power without fortification was just a target. He began building. He restored old fortresses. He constructed new ones. The crown jewel was Suceava, his capital. He didn't just repair the walls, he engineered them. He studied the new god of war, gunpowder, artillery, and he built walls thick enough to absorb cannon fire. He dug moats. He stockpiled grain, weapons, gold. Suceava became a message written in stone. The age of weak Moldavian princes was over. By the early 1460s, Stephen had done the impossible. He had pacified his own nobility. He had a loyal army. He had a fortified capital. He had a full treasury. Moldavia, for the first time in decades, was stable. But stability in the Balkans is not a resting place. It's a warning, because the moment you stop looking over your shoulder, someone puts a knife in your back. South of the border, Vlad Dracula was picking a fight he couldn't win. He had stopped paying tribute to the Ottoman Sultan. He had begun his famous campaign of impaling Turkish envoys and raiding Ottoman towns. It was spectacular, it was suicidal, and it put Stephen in an impossible position. The code of honor said Stephen should ride south and fight beside his cousin. They were blood, they were allies. Vlad had helped him take the throne, but Stephen was not a knight in a story. He was a ruler, and he looked at Vlad's reckless provocation, and he looked at his own fragile new state, and he made a calculation that history still argues about. When the time came to choose between saving his friend and saving his country, Stephen didn't just hesitate. He drew his sword, and he pointed it at Vlad. There is a fortress at the mouth of the Danube River called Chilia. In the 15th century, it wasn't just a castle, it was the economic throat of the entire region. Whoever controlled Chilia controlled the trade routes between the Black Sea and Central Europe. Grain, furs, slaves, salt, everything moved through that choke point. For years, it had been garrisoned by Hungarians and Wallachians. Stephen knew that if Moldavia was going to survive, he needed that fortress. He couldn't leave it in the hands of a cousin who was about to get himself killed. In June of 1462, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had conquered Constantinople 9 years earlier, led a massive army into Wallachia to crush Vlad once and for all. This was the moment for Christian unity. This was the moment for Stephen to ride south and stand shoulder to shoulder with his blood brother against the Islamic tide. Instead, Stephen marched his army to Chilia, not to help Vlad, to take the fortress from him. While Vlad was launching his famous night attack on the Sultan's camp, trying to assassinate Mehmed in his tent, Stephen was besieging Vlad's own garrisons in the north. He was opening a second front against his ally. It was betrayal. Cold, calculated, unforgivable betrayal. And it worked. Stephen bombarded Chilia for 8 days. His cannons pounded the walls until the Hungarian and Wallachian defenders realized they were abandoned. Vlad wasn't coming to save them. He was too busy fighting for his life in the south. They surrendered. Stephen took the fortress. And in the process, he took an arrow in the ankle. The wound went deep. It shattered bone. It never healed properly. For the rest of his life, Stephen would walk with pain. Every step was a reminder of what he had done. Every winter, when the cold made the injury throb, he would remember the night he turned his back on his cousin. From a sentimental perspective, it was a betrayal. From a strategic perspective, it was genius. By seizing Chilia, Stephen secured Moldavia's economy. He closed the Danube Delta to the Ottoman navy. He knew Vlad was doomed. Vlad's terror tactics had alienated his own nobles. He had no allies left. The Ottomans were going to crush him, and when they did, they would install a puppet ruler. Stephen calculated that it was better for Moldavia to hold the keys to the Danube than to let them sink with Vlad's burning ship. And the ship did burn. Shortly after Stephen took Chilia, Vlad was forced to flee into Hungary, where he was imprisoned not by the Turks, but by King Matthias Corvinus. The Hungarians, supposed defenders of Christendom, locked Vlad in a tower for 12 years. In his place, the Ottomans installed Vlad's younger brother, Radu the Handsome. Radu was everything Vlad was not: diplomatic, compliant, loyal to the Sultan. Wallachia became an Ottoman province in all but name. Stephen stood alone. The dragon in the south was gone. There was no longer a buffer zone. The path to Moldavia was wide open, and Stephen had just stolen a fortress from the Ottoman sphere of influence. He knew the bill would come due. He knew Mehmed II would not forget. So he spent the next decade preparing. He stopped paying tribute to the Sultan. It was a direct challenge, the same challenge Vlad had made. But Stephen didn't rely on spikes and psychological warfare. He relied on structure. He relied on the Viteji, his peasant army. He relied on the network of fortresses he had painstakingly built. In 1474, the summons arrived. Mehmed the Conqueror was tired of this insolent Moldavian prince. He didn't just want tribute anymore, he wanted Moldavia. He sent an army of 120,000 men north toward the Danube. To put that number in perspective, the population of London at the time was barely 50,000. This was not an army. This was a migrating nation. Janissaries, Christian boys, stolen from their families and raised as fanatical Muslim warriors. Sipahi cavalry, heavy horsemen in layered armor, artillery trains, camp followers, livestock. It stretched for miles, and it had one mission: crush Stephen, install a puppet, and turn Moldavia into a stepping stone for the invasion of Poland and Hungary. Stephen could muster perhaps 40,000 men. Most of them were not professional soldiers. They were the Rosciori free peasants with spears, axes, and bows. On paper, it was a suicide mission. 3-to-1 odds against the most powerful military machine on the planet. But Stephen looked at the calendar. He looked at the sky. Winter was coming, and he decided to weaponize the landscape. He issued an order that horrified even his own people: leave nothing for the enemy. This was scorched earth taken to its absolute extreme. As the Ottoman column lumbered north, they found a ghost world. Villages were empty, granaries were burned, wells were poisoned with animal carcasses. The Moldavians had taken their livestock and disappeared into the forests and mountains. The Ottomans were marching through a land that had deliberately erased itself. You're an Ottoman soldier. You've marched hundreds of miles from home. The temperature is dropping below freezing. You're hungry, but there's no food. You're thirsty, but the water will kill you. And you're being watched. You can feel it. Eyes in the trees. Shadows moving at the edge of the forest. Every few hours, Moldavian light cavalry bursts out of the tree line, fires a volley of arrows into your flank, and vanishes before you can mount a counterattack. They're not trying to destroy you. They're bleeding you, slowly, methodically, turning the march into an open wound that won't stop leaking. The Ottoman general, Suleiman Pasha, pressed forward. He was arrogant. He believed that if he could just force Stephen into an open battle, superior numbers and firepower would decide the outcome. He aimed for Suchieva, Stephen's capital. He didn't realize he was being herded. Stephen had chosen the battlefield weeks in advance. a narrow valley near a town called Vaslui. It was a place where Ottoman numbers would mean nothing, where the ground itself would become a weapon. By January of 1475, the Ottoman army stumbled into the valley. They were exhausted, they were starving, they were demoralized, and waiting for them in the fog was Stephen, his peasant soldiers, and a plan so audacious it's still studied in military academies. The morning of January 10th, 1475. The sun doesn't rise. The valley is choked with fog so thick you can't see your own hand in front of your face. Suleiman Pasha orders his troops forward. He funnels them across a narrow bridge into the valley. He thinks he's marching into a battlefield. He's marching into a trap. The ground is not solid. The winter thaw has turned the marshland into freezing mud. As the Ottoman heavy cavalry charges forward, their horses don't gallop, they sink. The pride of the Sultan's army is immobilized, flailing in the muck, unable to maneuver. Then the silence breaks. Stephen has positioned his artillery on the surrounding hills. They fire blindly into the mist. The target is so dense they can't miss. Cannonballs tear through the packed ranks of janissaries. But the cannon fire is just the prelude. The real genius comes from the forest. Stephen has hidden musicians, buglers and drummers deep in the woods to the side of the battlefield. At his signal, they begin to play. Thousands of bugles blast the signal for a charge. Drums thunder through the trees. To the Ottoman commanders, disoriented by fog and chaos, it sounds like a massive fresh army is attacking their flank. Suleiman panics. He orders his troops to turn and face this invisible threat. But there is no army in the woods. There is only sound. As the Ottoman lines twist in confusion, exposing their backs, Stephen unleashes the real attack. His heavy infantry and peasant soldiers, who have been waiting silently in the mist, charge. They don't fight with elegance. They fight with the fury of men defending their homes. They wield long axes and scythes, weapons designed to pull knights off horses and hack through armor. The result is not a battle, it's a slaughter. The Ottoman army dissolves into a panicked mob. They trample each other trying to escape. The bridge becomes a bottleneck of death. Those who aren't cut down by Moldavians drown in the freezing marshes. By the time the fog lifts, 40,000 Ottoman soldiers are dead, 4 pashas are killed, over 100 standards are captured. It is the greatest defeat the Ottoman Empire has ever suffered at the hands of a Christian army. Stephen rides through the carnage. His soldiers are celebrating, calling it a miracle, calling it the hand of God. But Stephen doesn't celebrate. He knows exactly what he's achieved. And more importantly, he knows what he hasn't. He has won a battle, not a war. He sits down that night and writes letters to the Pope, to the kings of Europe. It's not a victory lap. It's a desperate warning. I have cut off the right hand of the Sultan, he writes, but the other hand is coming. He knows Mehmed. He knows the Sultan will not accept this humiliation. Vaslui wasn't the end. It was the provocation for something much worse. The conqueror would not send a general next time. He would come himself, and he would bring hell. Victory is a drug. Europe was high on it. The Pope hailed Stephen as the athlete of Christ. Royal courts from Venice to Budapest sent letters of congratulation, promises of support, declarations of eternal friendship. But letters don't stop cannonballs. Letters don't feed soldiers. And while the West celebrated, Mehmed II was doing what conquerors do when they taste humiliation. He was gathering a storm. In the summer of 1476, the Sultan did something he rarely did. He took personal command. He marched north with an army that made the previous invasion look like a scouting party. But this time, he brought an insurance policy. He coordinated with the Crimean Tatars to invade Moldavia from the east simultaneously. It was a strategic vice. A pincer movement designed to crush Stephen between two forces. Stephen was waiting in his prepared defences in the west when the news arrived. The Tatars were burning villages in the east. His peasant soldiers, the Roshiori, began to panic. These were not professional warriors. These were farmers. And their farms were burning. Their families were dying. A soldier who's worried about his burning home is useless in battle. Stephen knew this. So he made a decision that would cost him everything. He let them go. He released the bulk of his army to defend their villages in the east. He was left with barely 10,000 professional soldiers to face the full wrath of the Ottoman Empire. He chose his ground carefully, a plateau near a place called Ruzboyeni, surrounded by dense forests. He couldn't win by force. He had to turn the terrain into a weapon. As the Ottoman vanguard approached, Stephen did something that sounds insane until you understand the mathematics of desperation. He set the forest on fire. Imagine fighting in an oven. The Janissaries advanced through smoke and falling timber. The heat was suffocating. The visibility was zero. For hours, Stephen's small force held the line, fighting like demons in the burning undergrowth. But mathematics is indifferent to courage. The sheer weight of Ottoman numbers was undeniable. Mehmed, seeing his elite troops falter, threw his personal guard into the battle, the Sultan's own men, the final reserve. The Ottoman wave broke over the Moldavian shield wall. Stephen's army wasn't just defeated, it was annihilated. The slaughter was so complete that the battlefield was later named Valia Alba, the White Valley, because for years afterward the ground was carpeted with sun-bleached bones. You could walk for miles and never touch dirt. Only the skeletal remains of men who had believed they could hold the line. Stephen escaped, barely. He rode through the chaos with a handful of surviving guards. His army was gone. His fortresses were isolated. His country was overrun. The Sultan was marching on his capital. This is the moment where most kings surrender. This is the moment where most men flee into exile, write their memoirs, and hope history is kind. Stephen did neither. There is a story told in every Romanian classroom. The details blur between fact and folklore, but the emotional truth has defined a nation for 500 years. The story goes that Stephen, wounded and exhausted, rode to the citadel of Neamț, where his mother was staying. He knocked on the gate. He was desperate for refuge, for comfort, for a moment of safety. The gate did not open. His mother appeared on the ramparts. She looked down at her son, the defeated king, the fugitive, and she refused to let him in. "I am the mother of a victor, not a coward," she said. "Go back, gather what men you can, die for your country, or come back victorious. But do not come here to hide." Whether she actually said those words is less important than what Stephen did next. He didn't break. He turned his horse around, he rode into the mountains, he gathered the survivors. He rallied the peasants who had returned from fighting the Tartars in the east. He became a ghost, a phantom moving through the forests, striking supply lines, ambushing patrols, refusing to die. Meanwhile, Mehmed was discovering something the Romans had learned centuries earlier. Conquering land is different from conquering people. He marched to Suceava, expecting surrender. The citadel fired cannons at him. He sent envoys demanding the gates be opened. They were returned in pieces. He laid siege. The walls held. He marched to Neamț. The gates remained shut. He tried to starve them out. But Stephen had stockpiled grain for exactly this scenario. The fortresses were designed to outlast sieges. Mehmed's army, vast and hungry, began to die. Not from arrows, from disease. The scorched earth tactics were working again. There was no food. The wells were poisoned. Plague broke out in the Ottoman camp. Dysentery followed. The Sultan, the man who had toppled Constantinople, found himself standing in a burned, deserted wasteland, watching his invincible army dissolve from within. You're Mehmed II. You've conquered empires. You've rewritten the map of Europe, and you're standing in the ruins of a peasant principality, swatting at flies, watching your soldiers die of starvation and disease. The fortresses won't surrender. The ghost army in the mountains won't engage, and winter is coming again. You've won the battle at Valia Alba, but you're losing the war. In August of 1476, with his supply lines stretched to the breaking point and his men dying faster than replacements could arrive, Mehmed ordered the retreat. He burned what was left of the villages. He salted the fields. He left a message of destruction, but he didn't break the prince. Stephen emerged from the mountains. He walked through Valia Alba. He looked at the bones of his friends, and he swore an oath. He would rebuild. He would survive. He would outlast them all. But as the Ottomans retreated south, a new threat appeared. This one didn't come from the pagan empire. It came from the Christian north. Poland, seeing Moldavia weak and bleeding, decided it was the perfect time to claim a piece of the territory. And Stephen was about to learn a lesson that every small nation eventually learns. Your neighbors are often more dangerous than your enemies. Because your enemies, at least, are honest about wanting to destroy you. By the 1490s, Stephen was an old man by medieval standards. He had spent 40 years in the saddle. His hair was grey. His face was lined with exhaustion. The wound in his ankle from the siege of Chilia had turned into a chronic, festering agony that never stopped. He limped. He couldn't ride for long distances anymore. He had earned a rest. He had earned gratitude. Instead, he got an invasion. In 1497, King John Albert of Poland gathered a massive army. Officially, he declared a crusade against the Ottomans. He claimed he was marching south to retake the lost ports of the Black Sea. Stephen, initially cautious but willing to cooperate, prepared to assist. But as the Polish army crossed the border, they didn't march toward the Turks. They marched straight for Suceava, straight for Stephen's capital. The mask slipped. John Albert didn't want to fight the Sultan. He wanted to depose Stephen and replace him with his own younger brother, Sigismund. It was a naked power grab wrapped in the flag of a holy war. The shield of Christendom was being attacked from behind by the very people he had been protecting for decades. John Albert made a fatal mistake. He assumed the old lion had lost his teeth. He laid siege to Suceava, pounding the walls with cannons for 3 weeks. But Stephen had spent 40 years turning that citadel into an impenetrable fortress. The Polish cannons bounced off the reinforced walls. The Polish supply lines began to vanish, cut by Moldavian raiders who moved like wolves through the forests. Realizing his crusade was turning into a disaster, John Albert negotiated a truce. He agreed to retreat back to Poland. Stephen agreed to let him go. On one condition: the Polish army must return the way they came, through the devastated roads they had already ruined, not through the fresh, untouched territories to the north. John Albert agreed. Then he broke his word. He marched his army into the rich wooded region of the Kosmin Forest. It was fertile land, untouched by war, and Stephen had explicitly forbidden him from entering it. Stephen was waiting. On October 26, 1497, the Polish heavy cavalry, the pride of the aristocracy, knights in full plate armor, entered the narrow ravines of the forest. The trees towered over them, ancient beech trees that blocked out the sky. The formation stretched for miles, and then, without warning, the forest collapsed. Stephen had ordered his men to cut through the trunks of massive beech trees almost all the way through. They disguised the cuts with moss and leaves. As the Polish column passed beneath, the Moldavians pushed the trees over. Dominoes of timber crashed down onto the cavalry. Horses were crushed. Knights were pinned under tons of wood. The formation shattered before a single arrow was fired. Then the peasants attacked. It wasn't a battle. It was a riot. The heavy Polish armor, designed to deflect lances in open fields, was useless against falling trees and mud. The Moldavian Rosciori swarmed over the trapped knights, dragging them off their horses, stripping them of their weapons, beating them with axes and clubs. The aftermath contains a detail so specific, so humiliating, that it reveals Stephen's utter contempt for the aristocracy that had betrayed him. He captured thousands of prisoners, including many high-ranking Polish nobles. He didn't ransom them, he didn't execute them, he put them to work. Stephen forced the proud Polish knights to break their swords. He had the metal reforged into plowshares. Then he yoked the nobleman men who had never done a day of manual labor in their lives to the plows like oxen. He forced them to till the fields they had tried to conquer. He made them plant acorns. Imagine the scene. Men who believed their blood was blue, who thought manual labor was beneath them, whipped and driven across the mud by the very peasants they had looked down upon. The beech forests of Bukowina that stand today are said to have grown from the acorns planted by the weeping nobility of Poland. This was Stephen's final lesson to the West. He was telling them that titles meant nothing, crowns meant nothing. If you came to his land as a conqueror, you would leave as a servant, or you wouldn't leave at all. He had defeated the Hungarians. He had defeated the Ottomans. He had defeated the Poles. He had secured his borders against every major power in Eastern Europe. But as the century turned and the year 1500 approached, Stephen faced an enemy he couldn't outmaneuver. He couldn't ambush it. He couldn't negotiate with it. His own body was failing. If you travel to the Bukowina region of Romania today, you will find something strange scattered among the green hills. Churches painted on the outside with vibrant frescoes that have survived 5 centuries of snow, rain, and wind. The most famous is Voronezh, known for a shade of blue so unique that art historians still call it Voronezh blue. Its composition remains a mystery, but its purpose was always clear. These weren't just places of worship. They were fortresses of identity, and they were paid for with blood. Tradition holds that Stephen made a pact. For every victory on the battlefield, he would build a monastery. By the end of his life, he had fought 47 battles and built 44 churches. It is a staggering ratio. No other monarch in European history has left such a dense physical legacy of gratitude. Or perhaps guilt. Stephen understood something that most conquerors miss. Armies die, walls crumble, kingdoms fall. But culture, faith, memory, those can survive occupation. By planting these fortified monasteries across the land, he was creating a backup system for Moldavian identity. He knew the Ottomans might eventually conquer the territory, but he wanted to ensure they could never conquer the soul of the people. While his stone legacy stood strong, his body was rotting. The wound he received in his ankle during the siege of Chilia in 1462, the campaign where he betrayed Vlad Dracula, had never healed. For 40 years, it had been a dull ache. Now, in the early 1500s, it became a life-threatening crisis. The infection spread, gangrene set in. Stephen, the man who could outride and outfight men half his age, was now confined to a litter. He summoned the best physicians money could buy. Doctors arrived from Venice, Genoa, Nuremberg. Their methods were medieval torture disguised as medicine. Records suggest they tried to burn the infection out with red-hot irons. They cauterized the wound repeatedly, trying to stop the rot. Imagine the discipline required to rule a country while enduring that level of agony. He received ambassadors while his leg throbbed with fire. He dictated letters to the Pope while unable to stand. He planned the defense of his borders while bedridden. The pain must have been excruciating, a constant burning reminder of the violent path he had chosen. In these final years, Stephen retired more frequently to the Putna monastery, his first and greatest foundation. He wasn't hiding. He was assessing the future. He looked at the map of Europe and saw the reality his successors would face. Hungary was weakening, Poland was treacherous, the West was indifferent, and the Ottoman Empire was only getting stronger. The path of total resistance was ending. Stephen realized something that would have horrified the young man who fled his father's murder at Ryusny. He realized that survival sometimes requires surrender. Not the surrender of cowards, but the surrender of strategists. He had held the gate closed for nearly half a century, buying Europe precious time, but he knew that after he was gone, the gate would burst open. His son Bogdan was capable, but he was not Stephen. No one was. So on his deathbed, the old strategist made one final calculation that seemed to contradict his entire life's work. He called his advisors and his son to his side, and he told them to make peace with the Sultan. On July 2nd, 1504, the bells of Putna Monastery began to toll. The sound rippled out across the valleys, carried from village to village, until the entire principality fell silent. The Iron Prince was dead. But before he took his last breath, Stephen left his son Bogdan III with instructions that stunned the court. He advised his son to accept Ottoman suzerainty, to become a vassal state. To the casual observer, this looks like failure. It looks like the old man finally broke. But look closer. This was Stephen's final masterstroke. He realized that Moldavia was too small to fight the Ottoman Empire forever. The goal was never to destroy the empire. The goal was to survive it. Stephen had fought for 47 years not to prevent contact with the Ottomans, but to dictate the terms of that contact. Because of the terror he had inflicted on Turkish armies at Vaslui, at Valia Alba, in countless skirmishes and ambushes, the Sultans respected him. They feared him. So when Moldavia finally submitted after his death, it did not do so as a conquered province. It did not become a pashalik, directly ruled by a Turkish governor. It remained a sovereign principality. It kept its own laws, its own army, its own church, its own princes. The Ottomans were forbidden from building mosques on Moldavian soil. They were forbidden from owning land. All the Sultan received was an annual tribute, a bag of gold once a year, and a promise of loyalty in foreign policy. Stephen had bought his country's autonomy with the blood of his enemies. He ensured that while the map might be painted Ottoman green, the heart of the country remained Moldavian. This unique status autonomy within the empire is the reason why Romania exists today as a Latin island in a Slavic sea. It's why the language survived. It's why the Orthodox faith survived. It's why the culture was never erased during centuries of Ottoman domination. So why does the world remember Vlad Dracula and not Stephen the Great? The answer lies in the nature of fame. Vlad is a global icon because he is a monster. He fits perfectly into our nightmares, a caricature of bloodlust that Bram Stoker could twist into a vampire. He is a great story because he is simple. Fear, blood, stakes, terror for its own sake. Stephen is harder to classify. He isn't a monster. He is a monarch. He burned towns, yes. He executed traitors, yes. He betrayed his cousin, yes. But he also built churches. He protected peasants. He negotiated treaties. He was a complex, contradictory human being who shouldered the weight of an entire civilization on his back for half a century. He doesn't fit into a horror novel. He fits into the pantheon of the greatest statesmen in history. Vlad fought for revenge. Stephen fought for tomorrow. Today, if you visit Putna Monastery, you can stand before his tomb. It is made of white marble, simple, elegant. There are no spikes, no grim legends of undead walkers, just an inscription. For the most glorious prince. History has a way of filtering out the noise. The Ottoman Empire has fallen. The Kingdom of Poland is gone. The Kingdom of Hungary was partitioned. But Moldavia, the core of modern Romania, survived. It survived because one man, 500 years ago, was willing to be the surgeon. He was willing to cut, burn, and betray to keep the patient alive. Stephen the Great didn't just hold the line, he drew it. And he drew it in iron so deep that not even 5 centuries of wind and war could wash it away. You're standing at his tomb now. The monastery is quiet. The frescoes on the walls depict saints and angels, scenes of divine judgment. But you know the truth. The man buried here wasn't a saint. He was a calculator, a survivor, a man who understood that the world doesn't reward the noble, it rewards the ruthless. And sometimes, if you're lucky, if you're disciplined, if you're willing to carry the weight of terrible choices, the ruthless can also be the saviors. So the next time you hear the name Dracula, remember the cousin who stood in the shadows. Remember the man who didn't just want to scare the darkness, but who built the light to hold it back. Remember Stephen the Great, the nightmare the Ottoman Empire couldn't kill, the prince who turned peasants into soldiers, soldiers into landowners, and a fractured principality into a nation that outlasted empires. If you found value in this story, if you want to explore more forgotten chapters of history that challenge the sanitized narratives we've been taught, subscribe and turn on notifications. And I want to hear from you. Do you think Stephen was right to betray Vlad at Chilia to save his country? Or is loyalty to family worth more than political survival? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.